Well, there's some interesting words that have now come up challenging sort of the orthodox scientific metaphysics: spirit, consciousness. These words, which most people can identify with at one level or another, have been excluded. And it's striking to me that scientists who use their own consciousness and very often their own deep intuitions to develop their theories have operated on assumptions that deny the very existence of those intuitions.
Well, we all have a certain amount of ability to shut out certain kinds of experience while we're involved with others. But, you know, while you raise these questions, it's in no way denigrating the kind of science that we have and the things that it can do. But we have a science that was dedicated to prediction and to control and to devising manipulative technologies, controlling the physical environment. And for that purpose, it's absolutely superb. But the mistake was made largely by the non-scientists, I think, in elevating that kind of a worldview into the position of a worldview by which you try to guide your life, and in particular, guide the powerful institutions of society.
I'd like to go back to William James, one of the founders of American psychology, who took the notion of empiricism, which is one of the foundation words of science, and developed it. I guess he thought he would carry it as far as it could be carried, and he developed what he called radical empiricism. Could you talk about that?
That's right. In fact, he played it safe, and the material wasn't even published until after his death, or at least it wasn't gathered together into a book. But the basic principle of radical empiricism is simply, yes, empiricism is how we find out. We try things, we observe, we gather all the data that we can. But radical empiricism has two principles. One is that you don't leave out anything, especially you don't leave out anything on the basis that it couldn't happen because our scientific laws said it couldn't happen. And the other part of it is that you include nothing but experience. That is, your science is based totally on experience, but it's external and internal experience.
In other words, if conventional science maintains that all of our knowledge comes through our senses, the radical empiricist says, yes, but what does it mean to obtain knowledge through the senses? Isn't there a consciousness in there?
Yes, I think the radical empiricists would probably say that.
Yeah. And in many ways, the current debate is one in which scientists from many disciplines, from anesthesiology to quantum physics to psychology and computer science, are trying to understand exactly what is the role of pure experience, of consciousness, of intuition in science.
I think that's exactly right. There really are two fundamental approaches to this, it seems to me. One is to say, science must be right because it's been so effective so far, so therefore there must be ways that we can patch up things through quantum physics, chaos theory, holographic theory, or whatever. We must be able to get consciousness in. The other approach is to say, whoa, if we go back now and look at the fundamental assumptions, and quantum physics helped here. Quantum physics showed that you couldn't leave out the consciousness of the observer. Well, then, you'd think then that the rational thing to do at that point is to say, well, let's go back and re-examine how we started and how consciousness got left out. That's, of course, not what happened by and large, but what happened was to increase the faith that somehow if we push quantum physics a little farther, we'll find the rest of consciousness. But consciousness was left out in the basic founding assumptions of science.
I mean, if we were to go back 200 or 300 years ago to Newtonian science or the writings of Francis Bacon, we'd see a worldview in which there's the observer and the observed, and the two are separate, that the observer does not influence or partake of that which is observed, typically.
Well, I think if you go back that far, what you'd find is that this was an expedient thing to do. It was a way to get started. It was a way to start an empirical science, And from a political standpoint, it was a way to start an empirical science without running afoul of the powerful church.
Yes.
Because they had staked out, the church had staked out the mind and consciousness and spirit as the church's territory. So it made all the sense in the world for science to start that way. It's just that by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, it's time to broaden the window.
Today we have a notion coming from many fields, from biology, from ecology, even in quantum physics, the notion of holism, that the universe is an unseparated whole at its deepest level.
That's right. Now, that brings up a very, very interesting point, that science is all about cause. That's why you have science. You're trying to find the explanation, the causes for the phenomena. Now, if really everything is connected to everything, if there really is only a oneness, everything then affects everything, and everything is the cause of everything in a certain sense, so that the whole idea of causality has to be revised.
And if I, as a scientist, am to accept that my own consciousness, the way I think, my values, my goals and aspirations, if these are an intimate part of the nature, of the natural world that I'm attempting to study, then I might begin to think differently about what I'm doing to begin with.
I think for the typical scientist, this is a whole succession of shocks. That is, the first shock is to realize that there's a bias introduced just in the way you create the experiment and even deciding to do it. And then there's a bias that comes in the perception, because we now recognize how powerfully the contents and the processes of the unconscious mind affect the way we perceive, not just with our eyes, but in every sense. And even though we all know that, it has never been applied to kind of the studying again of how we go about science. We act as though scientists didn't have an unconscious mind, everybody else does. But then, when you pursue the holism even further, then you find that there are even more subtle ways than perception and ESP in which things are connected, and you just can't create an experiment which is isolated, even though, of course, you can come reasonably close, and that makes the kind of science that we have now still extremely useful.
In other words, conventional science still offers us what appears to be a pretty good approximation of reality.
It's not about to be displaced for scientific work, but it probably is going to be displaced in terms of a cosmology and a worldview that will guide the society.
And one of the major areas of your own work is to look, I think, at the perennial philosophy, the mystical traditions, the work that's going on in transpersonal psychology and in psychic research, and to say, let's see what these traditions, where very serious people have been exploring consciousness in many different ways, what do they have to contribute to the scientific endeavor?
Well, if you're going to study consciousness, it only makes sense to turn to the ones who devoted their lives to that. And so you do pay attention to the mystics and the spiritual philosophers and especially to the core esoteric traditions of the various spiritual traditions of the earth.